And this is MPR News. I'm Mike Mulcahy. 11 days to go until Election Day, and people in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District have a big decision to make. The seat in Congress is open after Democrat Rick Nolan announced his retirement, so now voters have to choose who will represent the area for the next 2 years. The district covers northeastern Minnesota and includes the cities of Duluth, Brainerd, Grand Rapids, and International Falls. It stretches from just north of the Twin Cities metro area all the way to the Canadian border. The Republican candidate is Pete Stauber. He's a St. Louis County Commissioner, a former Duluth police officer, a business owner, and a former hockey player. The DFL candidate is Joe Radinovich. He's a former state representative who managed Rick Nolan's 2016 campaign and Jacob Fry's campaign for mayor of Minneapolis in 2017. Pete Stauber, Joe Radinovich, thanks a lot for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate this opportunity.
Glad to be here, Mike.
We won't have a lot of rules this hour. We're not running any stopwatches or anything like that, but the goal is to give you each a fair chance to state your positions on the issues. And we won't take calls, but I did ask the listeners in advance to send me some questions, and I hope to get to as many of those as possible. But let me start with a question of my own. Donald Trump was the first Republican presidential candidate to win the 8th District in a long, long time. He's a strong backer of yours, Pete Stauber. So tell us, where do you most agree with the president, and tell us if there are any areas where you disagree with the president.
You know, I agree with President Trump's his economic response. I agree with his. He's got really good business sense, and he's propelling this with his administration. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act have really benefited the 8th Congressional District. And as I'm going around the district, that's what I'm hearing. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act have benefited so many manufacturing facilities and small businesses like the one my brothers and I own. Some of the places that I disagree with, I've talked about this earlier. Had I been in Congress just 2 years ago when our president's first budget went forth, Mike, I would have been the first one to stand up and talk about zero funding for the Great Lakes Restorative Initiative that was in that initial budget. The Great Lakes are part of our economy, and I would have fought fiercely to ensure that funding is fully funded. And so those are some things that I would really fight on behalf of the 8th District voters. The other thing is the ZTE Corporation. I know that President Trump wanted to get into at least talk about some type of agreements with the Chinese government for the ZTE, the tech conglomerate. And I support Congress men and women on both sides of the aisle that said it wasn't a good idea. So I would have supported the Congress on that issue.
Joe Radinovich, anywhere you agree with the president, anywhere you disagree strongly with the president?
Yeah, well, I recognize as a Democrat that the president's a Republican, and I have an obligation to go out and work with him on issues that we have in common. And one of those issues that the president had identified during the 2016 campaign that I think a lot of us value as important is an investment in infrastructure. We wanted $1 trillion package that would have put millions of people to work across the country, that would have revitalized our infrastructure. But here's the problem, is that the president has espoused a view that says that we should, and Pete supports this as well, that we should give 80% of the benefit of the tax bill that was passed in January to the top 1% of income earners. The problem is that's going to lift the deficit to $1.1 trillion by next year. And in 400 hearings in the Congress on transportation, only 5 minutes was dedicated to talking about how we would afford and how we would pay for infrastructural investments. And so, you know, I feel it's a little bit disingenuous to say these things and then to not have a plan to do them.
And Mike, I would like to respond to that. Infrastructure investment is critically important. And I can go back to my time on the St. Louis County Board of Commissioners. I'm into my 6th year right now. We have invested heavily into infrastructure in St. Louis County, the roads and bridges. We have 6,000 lane miles that we're responsible for, and to be able to invest in our roads and infrastructure, invest in the over 300 bridges we're responsible for, that is something that's critically important. And Mike, that's why I want to go to Congress to make sure that we have the investment in our infrastructure. And I just gave the example as a St. Louis County Commissioner what I did.
Can you do that, though, with the deficit on the rise?
Yeah, we know that the deficit it's really a national security issue. And so what we have to look at is ways to cut the deficit and look at what we're putting forth for our children. We have to be responsible for this next generation, Mike, and by being responsible, we have to look at where we spend, where the efficiencies in government are, and where the deficiencies are, and work from there.
Joe Radinovich.
Yeah, here's the problem, Mike, is that Pete and I have had a number of times to debate, and in the last debate on KSTP, he claimed to care about the deficit that's going to increase to $1.1 trillion because of the tax cuts for the wealthiest people in this country, and we're not going to have an ability to pay for infrastructure now, and at the same time, Pete's party, the Republican Speaker of the House, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, and the President's administration have all called for cuts to Social Security and Medicare as a result of the deficit. And so what I think it is when somebody says that they want to do something and yet has no plan to do it, can't identify any specifics.
We have to remember that the Obama administration had $13 trillion.
If you're going to talk, I mean, I'd like to hear your positions, but so far it's just been empty words, and that's been the problem with this campaign.
Well, wait a minute, Joe Radinovich. So are you pledging to never cut Medicare, Social Security, or Medicaid if you get elected?
I am pledging to never cut those programs.
Pete Stauber, would you pledge never to cut those?
Yes, never. We will preserve, strengthen, and secure Medicare and Social Security for those seniors that deserve them. But let's get back to the infrastructure thing. Joe talks about the deficit. Under our 44th president, $13 trillion in debt. Now, we can do better than that, and that's why I'm going to Congress. I want to look and be a bipartisan congressman and do what's best for the 8th Congressional District. So we know that our deficit, we have to get our spending under control. We don't have a revenue problem in D.C. We have a spending problem.
So where are you
now have a revenue problem. And yeah, so I'd like to actually hear where he cut spending.
Do you want me to ask that?
Yeah, where would you vote to cut spending?
So, the president just put forth that he wants his directors and his agency leaders to look at cutting spending. Now, it would be irresponsible.
Where, Pete?
It would be irresponsible for me right now, after thousands of pages of budgets, without having to look at them. It would be irresponsible for me to say we're going to cut here and here, here and here. What I would like to do is look at, have the ability when I'm elected to go in and use a scalpel at certain areas of the budget. But it would be irresponsible for either Joe or I to say we're just going to blatantly cut. We know there's waste, fraud, and abuse in this government.
Is there anywhere that the government spends too much?
Well, I can tell you that under the agriculture bill, the government has identified under the SNAP benefits, Mike, under the SNAP benefits, a $5 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion of fraud. We want those benefits to go to the people that most need them. So that's just one area that we can look at cutting the fraud part of the fraudulent abuse. So we know there's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we certainly know there's in a $4 trillion government budget, Mike, there's areas we can cut.
So not naming one single area except for food stamps, and he talks about $5 billion. Here's the deal: is that we have a tax bill, Pete. We have a tax bill, Pete, that was passed in January that's going to add $1.9 trillion to the deficit, and 80% of that money is going to the top 1% of income earners. And at the same time, people in your party have repeatedly identified that they want to cut Social Security and Medicare. You cannot walk away from that. We don't need to send one more person out there.
The president just
mentioned. It is true, Pete.
Okay,
it is true that
Trump just mentioned. This week, we are going to preserve and protect and strengthen Medicare and Social Security.
Empty promises.
Gentlemen, I need you to speak one at a time because it's on the radio and it gets really confusing. Joe Radinovich, where would you cut federal spending, or would you want to repeal that tax cut?
Yes, I would want to repeal the tax cut that benefits the top income earners in the country. And I think that middle-class people deserve a tax cut. But here's the deal, is that we can't fund programs like Social Security and Medicare. We can't fund college affordability. We can't fund health care in this country because people say that we don't have enough money. But when it comes time for tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, or when it comes time to fund foreign wars abroad to the tune of $6 trillion for the last 2 wars, there's always enough money for that. And what I believe is that we ought to be investing in Americans and making sure that people growing up in communities like Crosby, Arrington, or Duluth or in Cambridge have an opportunity to be successful in this country. And by giving away the money to the wealthiest income earners, we fail to do that.
But Mike, the bottom line is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act has really incentivized and reinvigorated this economy. Just this week, I was at the Aiken Iron Works in Aiken, Minnesota. spoke to the owner, Jeff. He's owned it for 40 years. This is one of his best years ever. And when I asked him, I said, Jeff, how has the Tax Cut and Jobs Act affected you? He looked at me and smiled. He says, it's great because it has brought the tax rate down to 21%. They have profit sharing for their employees. And Jeff said, a week before Christmas, our employees are going to get a healthy bonus. That's the type of stuff that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act has really helped. And 25%, correction, $2,500 on average for the Minnesota 8 family. That is real money.
Joe Radinovich, that sounds pretty good. You want to repeal it.
$2,500 as an average, is an average, right? So there are people who are going to make a lot less than that, and there are people who are in the 1% who are going to get average tax cuts of $40,000 at the expense of programs like Social Security and Medicare. And it's great that Aiken Iron Works is able to give a bonus to the people, but the facts of the matter are that over 100 times more money will be put into stock buybacks than into wage increases for workers in this country. Stock buybacks are a way that companies increase the share or the price of their stock and enrich stockholders. It's a policy that is going to exacerbate the deficit, and it's going to threaten programs that are vital for the security of communities like ours in the 8th Congressional District. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, healthcare, and college affordability.
Mike, just this past weekend, I was at a brewery in Two Harbors, and I asked the same question to the owner. I said, how has the Tax Cut and Jobs Act helped you? And she said, per barrel of brewed beer, the federal tax went from $7 to $3.50. I said, how much is that saving your small brewery? She said, close to $70,000. That's real economic savings. They can invest in their employees. They can expand. So in Two Harbors, Minnesota, $70,000 is a lot of money. And I would ask Joe, which family would you like to take the $2,500 from?
Pete, we can protect middle-class tax cuts without having tax cuts that benefit the top 1%. They are not mutual. They are not exclusive.
So you support the tax cuts?
No, I support middle-class tax cuts. These are not middle-class tax cuts, Pete. 80% of the benefit will go.
The 8th district
Pete,
is middle class,
Pete,
Joe.
The 8th district is middle class, Pete, but 80% of the benefit of this tax bill is going to go to the top 1%. And Pete, let me finish, Pete. And the deficit will balloon to $1.1 trillion. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, Mitch McConnell, last week, the Senate Majority Leader, both Republicans, the President's own administration, have all said that their plan for the next session is to cut Social Security and Medicare. It's on the record. It's a fact. You cannot deny that.
Joe, it's interesting you want to be a fiscal hawk when you voted for a $2 billion tax increase for the state of Minnesota. And so it's kind of hypocritical for you to stand here. But
You're darn right I voted for that, Pete.
Bottom line is the tax...
Let him respond, Pete. Let him respond.
The bottom line is the... Wait a minute.
No.
The bottom line
Pete,
is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has reinvigorated this economy. Small business owners like myself, Mike, really appreciate that.
Pete, let me address this. Let me address this allegation.
Let
me address this.
And what's happening
This is important.
I need one at a time.
Let me give me some time here, Pete. Pete. $2 billion. You're going to accuse me of raising taxes $2 billion. I am guilty as charged. Here's the deal, that for 8 out of 10 years, this state faced budget deficits. And rather than asking people who could afford the most to pay a little bit more so that schools like Crosby Arrington didn't have to cut half their, let me finish, Pete, didn't have to cut half their shop classes, the issue here is that we increased taxes by 2% on income above $250,000 for joint filers. So if you made $260,000 after our tax increase, you paid an additional $200 in income taxes. That's a fact. I don't know. Most people in the 8th District are not making $250,000 as a household, and they're going to be hurt by cuts to their schools. That's why we passed tax increase in this.
The taxpayers threw you out after one term.
All right, let me just remind everybody you're listening to a debate on the major party candidates for the 8th Congressional District seat. Pete Stauber is the Republican and Joe Radinovich is the DFLer, and as you can tell, they disagree on a few things. So let me bring up a question, change the subject a little bit, bring up a question from a listener. Is health care a right or a privilege? And let's start there. Pete Stauber.
You know, health care is an essential benefit without a doubt. It's an essential benefit that is needed by every American in this country.
Joe Radinovich.
Healthcare is a right in the richest and most productive country in the world, and we can't afford to let people pay $300 a vial for insulin, rationing their insulin, or making decisions about whether they can pay their healthcare bill. In Little Falls, there are farmers paying $40,000 on the individual market for health insurance. Steelworkers on the Iron Range are trying to bargain a fair contract where healthcare benefits are the sticking point. This is an issue that we have an ability to fix in this country. Every other country, every other industrialized nation has gotten this right. We pay more per person than any other country in the world, and we have 30 million people who are still uninsured. And the fact of the matter is we're not going to be able to do this while we still have a profit motive in our healthcare system. We are the only country in the world, well, the only industrialized nation in the world that allows people to make a buck off somebody who's sick. The highest paid health. Yeah.
A listener asks, so if you want Medicare for everyone, how much does it cost, and where does the money come from after we just talked about a growing deficit?
Well, so here's the deal: is people are already paying healthcare expenses in this country right now. We pay $3.4 trillion, annually right now at this point. We pay 18% of the entire economy of this country is wrapped up in healthcare spending. But no other nation has it like this, right? That's the problem, is that Germany spends 12% of their GDP on healthcare, and that's the next highest nation. What we can do is, instead of having people pay premiums to insurance companies where 13 to 18% of that is going into overhead, and we're seeing CEOs make $66 million and not heal one single person, then the issue really becomes that public programs operate at a much more efficient level. And instead of paying $66 million to insurance executives, think about how many doctors and nurses or other healthcare providers that could pay for.
All right, Pete Stauber.
Mike, Joe has zero credibility on health insurance. When he was in the legislature, he was one of the deciding votes to bring us MNsure, which we know was an unmitigated disaster. Premiums skyrocketed. Hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans were thrown off their health care, including those with pre-existing conditions. And so he wants the keys to the nation's health care. We know that his Medicare for All scheme will not work. It'll be a budget buster. For those people... Hold on, Mike. Okay. For those people who are on employer-paid insurance, you're going to get thrown off. For our seniors that have toiled their entire life from waiting to get on Medicare, a benefit that they were promised and they earned, and the veterans like my wife will be thrown off their health care altogether. And Joe, when he tried to explain at the last debate how he was going to pay for it, it was raising taxes, and the Washington Post gave him 3 Pinocchios for that.
So what would you do?
That's not true. The Washington
Pete Stauber,
Post.
hang on just one second. Pete Stauber, what would you do then to make health care more affordable and more available?
First of all, let's face it, there's not a red or a blue playbook. There's not a Republican or a Democrat that has the monopoly on the good ideas. Mike, what I want to do is start with things we can agree on. And I think Joe agrees that pre-existing conditions should be covered. We need to look at associated health plans for small businesses like myself, Mike, that can pool our resources together and have the opportunity to have our employees have affordable health insurance. We need it affordable, accessible, and of quality. And just last week, Mike, I spoke to physicians and hospital administrators, and they said Joe's plan would be devastating, not only for the state of Minnesota.
I heard your criticism of his plan, though, but I'm trying to figure out what you would do.
I just talked about it. Let's start from where things we can agree on and work out. We know that we need it affordable, accessible, and of quality. But we don't need to take a sledgehammer to our healthcare system. Joe and his allies were the same group that said, if you want your doctor, you can keep him. If you like your plan, you can keep it. We know there are some good things in the Affordable Care Act, and I think we start from there.
So you wouldn't repeal it?
No, because we don't have anything in place that is better at this point.
The Republican health care plan.
So what we need to do, Mike, is as we go forward, really have a bipartisan effort and not care which political party gets the credit, and do what's right for the American people.
Have Joe read in.
Yeah, so there's a number of things in there that are worth addressing. The first is that not everybody agrees that associated healthcare plans are a good way to go. In fact, many experts think that that's exactly the problem, is that what we'll end up with is junk coverage, which is the problem that we had before the Affordable Care Act. My stepdad's a self-employed electrician, right? For all of his life, he was buying plans that were offering insufficient coverage. Why? Because they were the only plans that he could afford. And so what the Affordable Care Act did was that it made sure that every plan was going to carry certain protections in it so that it would be a useful plan. It increased price, but it also brought people with pre-existing conditions into the pool, and it allowed them to pay a rate that wasn't higher than everybody else, which is the issue that people with pre-existing conditions have. Here's the deal, is that the Republicans tried to pass a health care plan this last year that Pete refuses to take a position on. that would endanger 275,000 people with pre-existing conditions just in our district alone. It would make coverage unattainable or unaffordable. I want to say one more thing, too, about this, which is that when we talk about universal health care, which Canada has, which the European nations have, which even Mexico has, when we talk about universal health care like that, what that means is that everybody will have coverage. Everybody will have basic coverage. So it's disingenuous of Pete to say that we'll be kicking people off their plans. Yes, we'll be eliminating some of those plans, but everybody will have coverage.
That people really
everybody will have coverage.
Yeah, and he just admitted it's going to eliminate plans, and that's what I just said. It's going to kick people off their health insurance that their employees paid for it. You have to remember when Joe comes up and starts talking about this, he has zero credibility. He brought us the worst healthcare disaster in the state of Minnesota that we're still digging out of,
but you wouldn't repeal that.
And Mike, he voted to give MNsure executives taxpayer-funded bonuses when MNsure was burning up and the websites were broken. I've just talked about the things we can agree on, Mike. Start with that.
We can't agree on those things, Pete. Experts don't agree on those things.
You don't agree on pre-existing conditions?
No, I do, but here's the thing is my party has a plan.
Let's start from there.
Your party has voted to endanger people with pre-existing conditions.
Not.
Republican governors are suing so that they don't have to cover people with pre-existing conditions.
The administration thousand people off, Joe. You kicked several 100,000 people off their insurance when you voted for MNsure, including pre-existing conditions. You know, my wife and I have a 16-year-old son with Down syndrome, and this is our fourth debate, and I've told Joe this. I will require insurance companies to cover pre-existing conditions. My son is born with two of them. I have a nephew at age 2 who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes through no fault of his own. Why should he suffer the rest of his life? Joe continues to propel the myth. Hang on. Joe continues to propel the myth that Pete Stauber doesn't support pre-existing conditions, and I do. I've told
the Global Association of people of advocates for those with Down syndrome came out against the Republican health care plan because it would endanger people with pre-existing conditions, making their health care unaffordable or unattainable. What we can do is we can sit here and talk, but the reality and the facts on the ground are that the president's own administration is expanding waivers so that these insurance companies don't have to cover people with pre-existing conditions.
Wrong.
No, that's not wrong. It's a fact. You can Google it, Pete. You can literally look this up.
Wrong.
These are
He's wrong.
I need you to talk one at a time, though.
These
seriously.
are cheap talking points.
Let's just have some. Let's just be a little more civil. Go ahead, Joe. Finish up.
Yeah. So what we have are words and we have actions, and words are not matching the actions when it comes to Republicans on health care. The president's administration just last week is expanding access to waivers so that people or that insurance companies in many states won't have to cover people with pre-existing conditions. The Republicans tried to pass a health care bill that would endanger 275,000 just in the 8th Congressional district pre-existing conditions. There are words and then there are records, and the words are not matching the records in this particular case for Pete and the Republicans.
Pete Stauber.
Joe's got a reckless record in the Minnesota House for bringing us MNsure. That's period. That's just the facts. His reckless vote on 2 reckless votes on MNsure. He's got zero credibility, as I've stated. I want to be able to work on both sides of the aisle to ensure that every Minnesotan has affordable, accessible, and quality health care.
Talk about empty talking points.
That's Pete Stauber and Joe Radinovich. They are the candidates for Congress in Minnesota's 8th District. Let me change the subject from health care and go to another question I got from a listener. And I think you both have probably heard this one before. Where do you stand on copper nickel mining on public lands or in environmentally sensitive areas? And I think specifically they're talking about the Twin Metals project, which is proposed to be just a couple miles from the boundary waters. And Pete Stauber, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm the only candidate that says, and I've said this for a while, I support iron ore mining, copper nickel mining, and Enbridge Line 3. You see, Mike, using a 21st century technology, we can have great paying jobs and mine copper nickel. Every company that wants to mine copper nickel must meet or exceed every single federal environmental standard and every single state environmental standard. Otherwise, they don't mine.
But you're saying there's no area off limits if they can meet those requirements.
Well, there is. The boundary waters has a buffer area. We can do both. Look at the economic impact as an example that PolyMet can bring. The fact of the matter is Minneapolis held the Super Bowl last year, and in that Super Bowl week, there's about a $505 or so million of economic activity. PolyMet alone will bring that economic boom to northeastern Minnesota every year for a minimum of 20 years. That's good paying jobs. We can do both. We can have great paying jobs, mine copper, nickel, and keep our environment and water clean. In fact, we demand that.
Joe Radinovich.
Yeah, there are two candidates that are pro-mining in this race. I think that projects that can meet or exceed the federal standards should be, and state standards, should be able to move forward. But there's a difference between being for mining companies and being for miners. And the issue here is that when we talk about what miners need, we need to make sure that we protect their ability to adapt in the face of many of the changes that we're seeing in the industry. For instance, in 1980, there were 14,500 iron miners producing 40 million tons of iron ore. Today, there's still 40 million tons being produced, but it takes 4,000 iron miners. And so making sure that we're not only, open to these processes, but that we're really focusing on the people who are doing the work is probably one of the most important things about this.
Mike, I sat with miners and their families on four separate occasions, public hearings, two at Mesaba East High School, and I spoke publicly, one at the deck, and then we had a rally in the city of Virginia. We met at the baseball field, and I walked shoulder to shoulder with miners and their families to Virginia High School and publicly spoke in support of copper nickel mining. So I'm not sure where Joe was at the time.
And yet we never see you at any contract rallies or steel dumping rallies or anything like that.
The bottom line is I'm the only one that supports copper nickel mining. Just yesterday, I was in Grand Marais.
That's not true, Pete.
Joe, just hang on. Go ahead, Pete.
Wait a minute. Just yesterday, I was in Grand Marais, Minnesota. Spoke to an individual who was with Joe talking about copper nickel mining with his supporters. At the end of the conversation, he waffled on his support for copper nickel mining because they were giving him grief for supporting it. And I was in Grand Marais, Minnesota yesterday.
Okay, let's let Joe respond.
That's like you can make up a story about something. I mean, that's ridiculous, Pete.
Joe, I was in Grand Marais, Minnesota yesterday.
So what does that have to do with anything?
Okay, but you just said that's not true.
No, well, what I said wasn't true was that, I can't remember now. I mean,
no, I didn't even start the story, and he said it wasn't true.
Well, it's just that kind of race, I guess. Here, we're 11 days away from the election. Well, let me ask the question this way. I mean, the district is so big, and there are so many different regions. It ranges from the exurbs of the Twin Cities to the Iron Range to Duluth. There are small towns, everything in between. How do you effectively represent everyone, or how do you look at the job? Do you have to represent everyone, or do you try to represent the majority? And Joe Radinovich, start with you.
Well, I think that the role of the congressperson in this district is to represent everyone. And this district is large and it is diverse, and it's many different regions and different economies in a lot of ways. But there are a lot of things that unite us. And what unites us, I think, is that everybody is trying to make sure that they can send their kid to college for an affordable rate. Everybody is trying to make sure that they can find affordable health care. They want their Social Security and Medicare protected. They want to make sure, I think a lot of people I hear from want to remove the corrupting influence of secret money from our political system. And these are things that I hear from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So there's a lot that unites us.
Pete Stauber.
Yeah, my life experience as a police officer for 23 years, a small business owner for 28 years, and a professional hockey player. When I go out to the district, I'm living my message. They understand when I talk to small businesses, which are the engine of our economy, when I talk about how hard it is to actually have to reach into your back pocket to make payroll when the cash flow is short, when I talk to individuals about working hard and trying to find a way for all of us to live. But you're talking about the ability in the 8th Congressional District, which is a diverse district. But the bottom line is when I go out and about, the people are excited about the potential for this economy. And I can tell you this, that, Mike, every generation has its challenges, and ours does too. But I firmly believe that our best days are yet to come, and that's why I'm running for this position, to make sure that our children and grandchildren have a more prosperous, more free United States than the greatest generation gave us.
Well, let me ask you this question. It's come up, and there was a hearing in Duluth this morning in court about these emails
Yep.
that you apparently sent back and forth with the Republican campaign committee on your county email system. Why not just release those emails and get the whole thing passed and get it over with?
The county had the responsibility to look into this matter. Mike, they did so. They found no wrongdoing and cleared the matter.
Is there something in the emails, though, that's super secret? Or
I support the county's response to the Dayton's administration's non-binding opinion. And we look at this from the bird's eye view. The fact of the matter is there was a resolution on the county board that failed, referenced this matter. And my opponent, Joe Radinovich, called St. Louis County commissioners and begged them to support the resolution, and he did it twice. To me, that's despicable and attempting to obstruct the process. Joe, you cannot deny
Sure I can.
You
It's not true.
called St. Louis County commissioners.
All right, Joe Radinovich on this issue, and then we'll...
Yeah, so number one, he didn't answer the question about why he won't release his emails. The state said that the county is interpreting the statute wrong. What's going on right now is that Pete is hiding behind a state law that says that representatives can communicate with their constituents, obviously in private, to protect everybody's interest. But what's going on is he's communicating with political interest in Washington, D.C., and we don't know what the content of those emails are. He was not cleared of any wrongdoing.
I certainly was.
He was in violation of county policy.
I was not.
That's exactly
Hold
what
on
you.
one second.
That's an immutable fact, Pete. So
Just finish.
Yeah, he was in violation of county policy. They said that there was no further review needed, but that was, as far as we know, not reviewed by anybody else. Only his political allies on the board. And so the interest here is in the public's ability to know what their representatives are doing behind closed doors. Pete repeatedly wants to bring up the fact that he says that character is what you do when nobody's looking, and yet he could end this. He could end the taxpayer expense in trying to defend this in a lawsuit just by releasing the 15 or 16 emails and letting the public know what he was doing with the National Republicans. Was he trying to undermine, Social Security?
Well, let's not
Medicare, or what?
speculate, but go ahead.
Mike, the fact of the matter is it's Joe and his allies that are bringing this suit. It's purely political, partisan. He's currently in a floundering campaign, and this is the unfortunate part of politics that desperate candidates and desperate campaigns do.
Editorial boards and people who value public transparency and accountability have been sounding off on how egregious it is that St. Louis County won't follow the advisory opinion of the state about how they're misinterpreting the statute. The issue here is that the public has a right to know what's going on with their money and their resources, and this clearly exists outside of the public's interest to protect privacy. This is Pete communicating with special interests in Washington, D.C. We want to know what it was about.
Mike, this is in 2006, then Senate candidate Amy Klobuchar went through something very similar to this, where the Hennepin County advisory stated that she should do something, and she didn't. And Amy Klobuchar is a sitting U.S. Senator.
Okay,
Let's see what Amy Klobuchar says about that. But
Joe Radinovich, the issue has come up, as you well know, in TV ads and elsewhere about your parking tickets and a marijuana paraphernalia citation. I had a question from a listener. Is there anything else in your record that you need to come clean about?
No, and this is the thing, is my record is public, right? And I've answered all of these questions over and over again about, the parking and speeding tickets, and I regret them, right? I mean, I shouldn't have had as many as I did, and I take responsibility for that. And I've owned up to this dismissed paraphernalia charge marijuana paraphernalia charge from when I was 18 years old, and I've taken accountability for that. I've made mistakes in my life, and I think that makes me more human. The real issue here is that, having done all of these things as I've done, Pete still can't be transparent about the emails, and most of us are wondering what's in those emails that's so bad that he wouldn't just let them out and stop the county having to defend this mess.
Mike, the fact of the matter is Joe didn't take accountability. He only paid his criminal fines when KSTP
Parking tickets
caught him. Then he paid his criminal fines. And at the debate in Duluth, the Duluth News Tribune editor Chuck Frederick, when they were interviewing him, said, "Is there anything else?" And he said, "No." Later, we found out there was this drug issue. And so that's why they brought it up at the debate. Joe talked about character. We have to look at character plays a big part in this. You know,
It absolutely does.
The Duluth News Tribune, I served 22 years, over 2 decades, as a police officer for the city of Duluth. After 22 years, the Duluth News Tribune looked into my personnel file. They didn't find one complaint from a citizen or one complaint from a coworker, and that it should tell the listeners that Pete Stauber was empathetic and caring in people's darkest hours as a police officer.
Joe Radinovich.
Yeah, so the fines that I paid late were parking tickets, and again, I regret that I had parking tickets and paid them late, but that's a fact of life for a lot of people who, you know, park in places where parking is tough, right? The marijuana paraphernalia ticket that I got when I was 18 years old was dismissed. It could have been expunged from my record. My fiance is a prosecutor. She informed me of that very recently. I wish she'd have told me that 6 months ago. But the fact of the matter is, I've been open and honest about all those things. I've made mistakes in my life. I've learned and I've grown, and that's part of being a real human being. But again, coming back to this email thing, it seems bizarre to me that Pete just won't release the 15 emails. If there's nothing to hide in them, why won't he release them?
Joe has to be transparent here. The fact of the matter is, Joe Radinovich would still be living in the Metro had Rick Nolan not vacated his seat. And that's a fact. On December 31st, Joe had written information to a House candidate donating to his campaign, and he gave an address, an apartment in Minneapolis. He has told the public that he never lived in Minneapolis. He commuted. This is the history with Joe and not being a transparent. And people see it throughout the district.
Okay.
And my goal is to I want to these last couple of weeks. I want to really get out and meet a lot of people to really show them, because the character in my life is comes about from my experiences, both good and bad, the hardships, the successes.
Okay.
You know, being a father, Mike, is one of the proudest things for me. And I can share with you that those of us who are parents, for example, never sleep good until all their kids are in bed. And that's what happened to me last night. And so this is resonating with the people. So character is how you behave when no one else is looking.
Okay,
and the only time success comes before sweat is in the dictionary.
Let's have Joe Radinovich give a response, then I have another question.
Yeah. So again, if character matters, then why won't Pete Stauber release the emails and stop these lawsuits? I think that's in the public interest. And the other thing is that, Pete, my dad was a construction electrician, and if he was lucky, he was working 2 hours away from home. Many times he was working in North Dakota or in Montana, and he had apartments in those places. I have never voted anywhere other than Crosby, Ironton, Minnesota. I have lived in Crosby my entire life. I have worked in the Twin Cities. I'm very proud of the work that I've done here, and on behalf of my good friend and somebody I think is going to be an excellent mayor, Jacob Fry. But these are ridiculous smears,
Joe,
and it's clear the
moved back from
desperation
the
you can't.
Metro.
Well, let me just ask a question on this broad character issue that came from a listener. When you're facing a tough decision, what personal experience do you use to help you decide what the next step should be? And Pete Stauber, let's start with you.
So as a police officer, small business owner, husband and father, there's tough choices almost on a daily basis. You go back to your experience and you do what's right. Experience matters, life experience matters, and as a police officer, for example, on the city of Duluth, we had to make instantaneous decisions, and those good decisions you make in those urgent moments, you have to rely on your experience to make them. And when you have experience as a police officer, some of those really immediate, really life altering decisions have to be made instantaneously. So I go back to my life. I go back to the experiences that I have been blessed with in my life to make those decisions, Mike.
Joe Radinovich.
I put myself in someone else's shoes, and that's easy enough for me to do because I have dealt with a great deal of adversity in my life. When I was 16 years old, my life was pretty good at that point. I came home from track practice on March 18th. I had a family member shoot himself, trying to take his own life. And 11 months after that, my mother was murdered by a separate family member who took his own life then as well. And I've struggled through 4 years after that. That was the period of time when I got that ticket. And, I made it through. But I recognize that not everybody had the resources that I did when I needed that. I had teachers around me who were supporting me, who lifted me up, who taught me that the value of public education is about more than textbooks and classrooms. I had a good health insurance because my dad had a good union electrician job. And I think that everybody deserves access to those things in life. And for me, putting myself in someone else's shoes and holding myself accountable to the values that I've always grown up with and that I've learned through good times and bad is how I make decisions.
Let me ask another question from a listener. This listener said, since the UN panel released its climate change report a couple of weeks ago that called for really some big changes in a hurry to make a difference, what, if anything, would you support to address climate change? And Pete Stauber, start with you.
Yeah, I read that report too, Mike, and it's an issue that we have to look at. I know that neither Joe nor I are scientists. We have to look at what are the causes and how can we reduce the emissions. And I think that it's a great, healthy discussion because at the scientific level, there's some discussions on what we can put forth that can slow the process. And I'm open to discussions and learn from the scientists because, like I say, neither Joe or I are scientists.
Joe Radinovich.
Climate change is real. There is no discussion anymore, and there hasn't been, frankly, a discussion for a long time. The overwhelming majority of scientists believe one thing about this, and that it's happening, and that it's caused by greenhouse gases like CO2 and like methane, and that it's largely caused by human activity, right? And so we have to be able to, number one, mitigate the damages that are already being done. I think that looks like reducing greenhouse gases, sequestering carbon, making sure that we, continue to advance sensible and sustainable policies that will reduce those gases. We also need to invest, I think, in renewable forms of energy to continue to diversify the energy basket. And beyond that, we're also, frankly, at this point, because people have been dragging their feet on this issue for so long, going to have to look at adaptation techniques. I think that's the real dilemma here. And every expert agrees on this. There is no conversation to have anymore.
Pete? Well, I'll reiterate what I just said. I said we have to look at things to make sure that we leave not only this country but this world in better shape than we got it. And so I'm always willing to look at things, and I'm a perpetual learner.
Another question from a listener. Are any new gun laws needed after recent mass shootings? For example, do you support background checks on all gun sales? And I think this person's looking for a yes or no answer. Joe Radinovich, start with you.
Yes.
You support background checks?
I do, yes.
Pete Stauber.
We have background checks. Mike, as a police officer for 23 years, I can say this while off duty in 1995, I was shot in the head in downtown Duluth. A few years later, while on duty, a perpetrator in a hostage situation got the jump on me, pulled a handgun within 5 feet, pulled the trigger, and by the grace of God, it malfunctioned, and I was literally fighting for my life. I still support our Second Amendment to have individual law-abiding citizens the right to keep and bear arms. There is not a person that I know that wants a career criminal, a drug addict, somebody who's going through crisis, or others that shouldn't possess or have a firearm. We need to keep those firearms out of those criminals' hands. And one of the things that I'm very proud of in St. Louis County, we have a lead prosecutor, our county attorney, Mark Rubin, who will not plead down any gun crime. And I'm very proud of that because he understands, and we understand, the importance of reducing violence in our communities. And so in St. Louis County, there's no pleading down gun crimes, Mike.
Joe Radinovich.
There are large loopholes in our background check system, and I think that's the spirit of the question that was asked, and that wasn't the answer that we got from Pete Stauber. The NRA is spending $200,000 to beat me right now, and I think it's in part because most gun owners recognize that we can have sensible reforms that protect people. I mean, we've seen now mass shootings in Las Vegas about a year ago. There were 450 people shot within 5 minutes because somebody was able to go buy multiple assault-style weapons to outfit them with bump stocks and high-capacity magazines and to wreak carnage on the streets of Las Vegas. And I think that in a civilized society, we can have both protection of the Second Amendment. I'm an avid hunter and have been my whole life, have plenty of guns myself, and also sensible gun reform.
The fact of the matter is, I think Joe and I agree on this.
Well,
sounds like he wants to have background checks for private sales, though.
Well, let's talk about private sales. So my 86-year-old father, who's towards the end of his life, let's say. So what Joe wants is when my father hands his firearm, his deer rifle that he's been using for 50, 60 years, to my 18-year-old, that has to be a background check. That's what he's advocating for. There are sensible alternatives and sensible solutions. And I'll give you an example. My good friend Gordon Ramsay, former chief of police in Duluth, now in Kansas, in Kansas, in the state of Kansas, in order to carry concealed, you have to meet some minimum requirements, which doesn't include training. You know, in Minnesota, to carry concealed, there's a training course you have to go to because it's a huge responsibility to carry concealed. And so somebody from Kansas comes to the state of Minnesota. That concerns me because they don't have the training.
So would you support that nationally then, to have some kind of training?
We talk about it, supporters of our Second Amendment talk about they want it to be like a driver's license. That's fine, but all states have to have consistent training. Like we know, and I've put 2 of my children through driver's ed right now. We know that there's the lecture and in classroom, and then street driving, and so we know that young drivers are put through a course, and we can expect them when they go to the state of Wisconsin, Mike, to understand the rules too. So historically, we can have a great discussion on that, and I'm willing to do that, and that's why I want to go to Congress, Mike.
Okay, Joe Radinovich.
When we talk about private sales, the biggest, most glaring loophole there is with gun shows. And that's what we're talking about cracking down on first, so that people can't go to a gun show where there are thousands and thousands of weapons, oftentimes hundreds of sellers, and go through and pick out any gun they want without having to go through a background check. That's the first line, right? We don't need to worry necessarily yet about private sales handing a gun down from your grandpa to the other thing. We can figure that in the future. But
that's
the
what
first
your group
point
wants to do.
My group, Pete.
Yeah,
what group?
Your allies.
You
and your allies want to restrict giving family members guns. You and your allies, that's what you're reporting. That's what you're saying.
What allies, Pete? The NRA is spending $200,000 to defeat me. They haven't advocated for one single solution in the face of the carnage.
Nancy Pelosi's super PAC.
Nancy Pelosi's super PAC
it wants to defeat me.
I don't have any support from Nancy Pelosi's super PAC.
Yes, you do. It's the dark
no one can see you giving the air quotes right now, Pete.
Joe.
Okay. 10 years ago, the economy was in shambles. The big banks were out of money, going bankrupt. The entire financial system was on the verge of collapse. Do you think we have adequate regulations now to protect against another crash like that, or do we need more? Joe Radinovich.
I think that what we need to do is make sure that we are not undermining sensible regulations that were put in place in the wake of that crash. Too often what's happened in American history is that we get too far from those disasters and we start to cater to the big banks and special interests, like my opponent is taking support from, and undermine important protections. So we are, when we see a crash like the one we saw in late 2008, I mean, that devastates retirements. I was at a Central States pension fund the other day where Teamsters, through no fault of their own, because big banks crashed the economy here in this country, are going to have 50% cuts to their pensions. These are the consequences for deregulation of the banking and financial sector services.
Pete Stauber.
The Dodd-Frank Act, when I talked to local community lenders and banks throughout the district, they said for them it was a disaster. We've had throughout Minnesota a couple 100 banks, small community banks, closed because of the onerous regulations put on them. I think that we have to be very sensible and logical and when we place rules and policies throughout this country. And that's just one example of going overboard. But look what's happening right now. The President Trump, for every rule or policy he brings forth, he takes out about 22. And look what the economy's doing. Look what it's doing for consumer confidence. Look what it's doing to small business and manufacturing. Surging unemployment is at historic lows. I think that's a good thing.
Is that because of a lack of regulations? Joe Radinovich, is that why the economy is booming?
No, the economy has had uninterrupted growth since the mid-Obama administration, when we came out of the financial crash that was a result of Republican deregulation. I mean, the fact of the matter is that President Obama inherited an economy in flames, which is why the deficit was so high when he took office. He reduced the deficit, I think, by about half over the course of his term, and also put sensible regulation in place. We're talking about the big banks. You know what? I support credit unions and their ability to make sure that that these regulations don't unduly impact them. They're an important segment of the local banking industry. But really what's happening is that Republicans in Washington, D.C. are not interested in the credit unions. They're interested in big financial institutions on Wall Street and other banking centers across the country. And they are the institutions that gambled with our mortgage debt. They're the institutions that heated up the economy for their own benefit. And when it came time for the crash, we bailed them out while people like the Teamsters, who have that Central States pension that crashed, are going to take 50% cuts. This is the fundamental problem with the economy. It's not that the rich people don't have enough money. It's that we don't protect people on Main Street when it comes time to do it.
Minnesota 8 families on average, because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, are going to be saving $2,500. That's $2,500 in their pocket. I understand Joe wants to take that away from them, and his leadership in Washington want to reverse the tax cuts. They want to raise taxes. They want to take a sledgehammer to our healthcare system. They want to impeach the president. I'm saying our economy is going very well. And so this is just a start. I think this is just a start, Mike, to this economy, and we're just getting going. And I want to go to Congress to keep it going, and that small businesses, Mike, can make it, and the entrepreneurial spirit can flourish.
Quick response from Joe Radinovich, then I'll let you guys make a closing statement.
Yeah. I've never once talked about impeaching the president. I think that the Mueller investigation should continue unimpeded for what it's worth, and I think that it's produced plenty of results.
And so do I.
Pete, both his campaign manager and his lawyer
and so do I.
Are facing 16 convictions, and we haven't heard one thing from you about that. But anyway, here's what I believe is I believe that this is about Main Street America. We need to make sure that we're protecting the people on Main Street, not the big banks, not the millionaires and billionaires, not the 1%. This is about an economy where everybody benefits, and that's the fundamental difference between Pete Stauber and I.
Pete Stauber, we're just out of time, so I'll give you like 40 seconds.
Okay. Thanks for having us, Mike. Joel, thanks for being here. The fundamental difference between Joe Radinovich and Pete Stauber is Pete Stauber believes in the people, believes in small businesses. Joe, through his limited life experience outside politics, always goes to the government for answers, and that's the fundamental difference. He goes to the government for health care. He goes to the government for many other things. I believe in the people. I believe in Minnesotans. I want to go to Congress and legislate from the lens of Main Street, Minnesota, and my blue-collar, common-sense, conservative message is resonating. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you. And Joe Radinovich, last 40 seconds.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Mike. And here's the big deal is that we've got an opportunity to make sure that we protect people going forward. The economy is changing very rapidly, and the answer is not to make sure that the wealthiest people among us have access to more money. The answer for us going forward is to make sure that we protect Social Security, Medicare, college affordability, and ensure that everybody has access to affordable health care in this country. We have the ability to do it. I don't take a dime in corporate PAC money, and I'm the only one in this race who has a chance to win that can say that.
That is Democrat Joe Radinovich. He was joined here by Republican Pete Stauber. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
They are running for Congress in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District, the northeast part of the state, ranging from the Twin Cities exurbs all the way up to the Canadian border. Great program. If you haven't voted yet, get out and vote. Election Day is November 6th. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you later. We even ended on time. Thank you. Was it fair?